All right, hopefully we're live. I'm going to wait a second to make sure it's actually going live. Okay, well, it is good to be in front of you today. I'm sorry that we're not gathering in person. I hope that you're all warm and safe. And welcome to my office, I guess. So, one of the most common accusations that is brought against the Bible and the church in general is that there are numerous contradictions in the Bible. You can find blogs and books written by relatively famous atheists claiming that there are hundreds of contradictions that disprove that the Bible is from God. Now, when we look at these supposed contradictions, some of them are almost silly. They're easy to disprove. They're easy to look and say, hey, that is not a contradiction. It's just a misunderstanding, or you're misunderstanding it. But some of these supposed contradictions look almost legitimate. They look almost like there might be a contradiction in the Bible. And if the Bible is God's inerrant word, if it is God breathed, then there should not be any contradictions. So the question becomes, what do we do with this? What do we do when we are presented with one of these supposed contradictions that looks like it might be legitimate? Well, we could ignore them, but while that might work for you, you may be able to just kind of shuttle it off and say, hey, that doesn't bother me. For some people, it might really shake their faith. And if you ignore it, well, maybe your children can't, or maybe your spouse or one of your best friends can't ignore the supposed contradiction. We could let them erode our faith. Now, of course, that's not the desired outcome. We don't want to let these supposed contradictions erode our faith. So we could also get angry, get mad at either the person who presented the supposed contradiction or the supposed contradiction itself. However, getting angry at it doesn't actually solve the problem. In fact, if you get angry about it, that might seem to prove to some people that there might actually be a contradiction. So what should we do? Well, what we should do is dig into the Bible, study the context, and seek resources to find the answers. The thing about this, though, is that takes work. It takes work to dig into the Bible. It takes work to study the context. And seeking resources can be difficult because not everybody has a full theological library right at their fingertips. So what do we do? Well, today we're starting in on a new sermon series about addressing alleged contradictions. Now, to be honest, this subject gets kind of deep. It gets kind of dense. And my thought was if we grouped all of these sermons together, that we would very quickly get burned out on these supposed contradictions. So what we're going to do is we're going to do one sermon about these alleged contradictions, and we'll cover a couple of different types of alleged contradictions. Then we'll do some other sermon series. And in a month and a half or so, we'll do another couple of supposed contradictions. And then a month and a half or so after that, we'll do another sermon on this. That way we get the information, but we're not burning ourselves out on it. And the alleged contradictions we're dealing with today are alleged numerical and geographical contradictions. Now, right there you have our outline. We're first going to talk about alleged numerical contradictions. Then we'll talk about alleged geographical contradictions. Now, we don't have the time today to go through all of the alleged numerical contradictions. We would be here all day. So, I've selected a few, some from the Old Testament, some from the New Testament, that I think give us a good grasp on what we might see when we address these supposed contradictions and how we can address them. Now, most of the information that I'm going through today has come from Eric Lyons' series, The Anvil Rings. It's a 3-book series. You can buy it at apologeticpress.com or whatever their website is. And it was Apologetics Press. If you're interested in this, if you want to dig into these supposed or alleged contradictions more, you can get that book series, and it goes into much greater depth than I'm going into today. Now, today is definitely not going to be a toe-stepping sermon. It's not one that's going to make you rethink your life choices, but it might be a little bit dense. This is one of those things, like Wayne Berger says, where we have to roll up our pant legs and dig into the deeper waters. So I encourage you, grab your Bible. If you have a note-taking outline, get that close to you, and let's dig in. And we're first going to talk about some alleged numerical contradictions. Now, before we even get into the alleged contradictions, we need to talk about a principle when addressing alleged contradictions. And here's that principle. If there is one or more legitimate, non-contradictory interpretations, then there is no contradiction. Sometimes skeptics will want us to nail down like exactly what it was, and then they'll poke holes in whatever answer we give. But if there are one or more, and the or more is fine, legitimate non-contradictory interpretations, then there is no contradiction. With that in mind, let's look at our first supposed contradiction. First one, the question: how many languages before the Tower of Babel? One or many? Now we might look at that and say, of course, there was only one, right? But turn with me to Genesis 10. Genesis 10, 1 through 7, and then verse 20. Starting in verse 1, Genesis 10, verse 1. Now these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, the sons that were born to them after the flood. Now it starts talking about their sons. We're going to go look at verse 5. Verse 5. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, every one according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. And then verse 20, these are the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. So that seems to indicate that people spoke different languages. But then, in Genesis 11:1, we read, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. So that states the whole earth spoke the same language. So the accusation that is brought against the Bible here is that there's a contradiction. Genesis 10 says many languages. Genesis 11 says one language. Okay. So to answer this, we need a few study and interpretation principles. The first one is context, context, context. And I'm going to say that over and over again, context, context, context. That's not just because I'm repeating it for emphasis. I am repeating it for emphasis. But it's also because there's different types of context. There's the literary context, there's the textual context, and then there's the historical and cultural context. And we need to look at each of these different types of contexts to understand what's being said here. And on top of that, we need to understand the literary composition of the section. And that's really key, understanding the literary composition of this section. So let's talk about the context. Genesis 10 and 11, quite frankly, they are not presented chronologically. As you read through Genesis 10, there is a lot that happens there that we can say by looking at the rest of the section happens after the Tower of Babel. What's being given here is that Genesis 10 gives a big picture overview of the spread of humanity after the flood. And it's not just saying, hey, these things happened before the flood or before the Tower of Babel and these other things happened after. It's just giving a big overview of the entire section. And then Genesis 11, 1 through 9 gives a detailed account of an important event, that is, how God made them disperse. Now, Genesis honestly does this quite a lot. Genesis 1 gives an overview. Genesis 2 gives the details of specific sections. Here, of course, Genesis 10 gives us an overview. Genesis 11 gives us some specifics. So we need to understand that this is not strictly chronological. And a lot of these supposed contradictions stem from a difference between the way that Americans think versus the way that the people in the ancient Near East thought. Because Americans, we love things to be strictly chronological. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But the people of the ancient Near East didn't think that way. They grouped things by importance and subject. And so we may say, hey, that's out of chronological order, and they wouldn't care about the chronological order unless they specifically specify this happened and then this happened. Okay, so the answer here is that there was one language before the Tower of Babel, and chapter 10 was just giving an overview of the spread of humanity. Okay, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Good one for us to get our feet wet in this subject. Now let's go a little deeper. How many daughters did Lot have? Now this question, it seems like it should be like a why does it even matter? But let's go through it. Genesis 19:8. Now set this up. If you remember what happened in this section of Genesis, God told Abraham that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plains. And Abraham bargained with him, begged him, and God finally agreed if there was 10 righteous people in the city, he would spare the city. But there weren't 10 righteous people. So God did, though, send some messengers, some angels, to go get Lot and his family out of the city. This is where we reach that point, because the men of the city were depraved, and they wanted to have the men that were visiting, the angels, come out so they could have carnal relations with them. And Lot, well, he says something that is pretty reprehensible, but this is what he says. 19, verse 8. Now behold, I have 2 daughters who have not had relations with man. Please let me bring them out to you, and do to them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men, insomuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof. Now I am not condoning what Lot was planning on doing there. I'm not saying it was good, that was a bad thing. However, he does say that he had 2 daughters who had not known a man. However, verse 19, or chapter 19, verse 14, says that Lot had sons-in-law. Let's read that. Verse 14, Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, and said, Up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But he appeared to his sons-in-law to be jesting. So, verse 8 says that Lot had 2 virgin daughters. Verse 14 says that he had sons-in-law. And the accusation that is made is that you can't have virgin daughters and son-in-laws. So, the interpretation principles needed are, again, context. I'm going to say that over and over again today. But also understanding translation variances. Now, this is kind of a weird concept, but if we understand that the different translators of the different translations, they're doing the best that they can with the information they have, but they do sometimes have biases or maybe pre-understandings, and so there might be differences between translations, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. We also need to have an understanding of ancient Near East marriage customs, and this is really kind of the crux of the matter. So there's really 2 options to answering this supposed contradiction. Let's examine the context of the first option. Option 1, we look at Genesis 19:15, which says, When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, Up, take your wives and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. And the key there is 2 daughters who are here. Okay, it's conceivable that Lot had married daughters who were not in the house with them. And if that were the case, then those daughters would have gotten destroyed in the city when God destroyed the city. So that is entirely possible. There's nothing that says he didn't have other daughters. But there's another option, which I think honestly is probably a stronger option, but it's worth looking at both of them. And that comes down to the translation variances. The King James and the New King James, when referring to the sons-in-law, say that these sons-in-law had married his daughters. So these sons-in-law had married the daughters, past tense. However, the New American Standard says who were to marry his daughters. And then the NIV says who were pledged to marry his daughters. So there's some translation variance. You look at the Hebrew words used here, and it's the same Hebrew wording, but the King James and New King James translated it differently. Now, there's a little bit of a question surrounding this particular word. I'm not going to go into the details of the Hebrew for you, but the gist of it is that it could mean that these men had already married his daughters or that they were going to marry his daughters. It could legitimately mean either one. And that brings us to an understanding of ancient Near East marriage customs. See, people who were betrothed were seen as being legally married, even though they did not live together and had not had intimate relations. Think of Joseph and Mary in the New Testament, how they were betrothed. Mary had not had carnal relations with a man, but in order for them to break that arrangement, Joseph would have had to divorce her, put her away. They were legally bound, but they were not yet living together and having carnal relations. Thus, the sons-in-law spoken of could be betrothed to Lot's daughters. And I honestly think that this is probably the case, that these young men were betrothed to Lot's daughters, and he urged them to come away so they could still, get married and have a family, and they didn't listen. They stayed in the city and got destroyed. So, the answer to this supposed contradiction, well, option 1 is that Lot could have had 2 more daughters who were married. Option 2 is that Lot's 2 daughters could have been betrothed, but not yet married. So we have more than one legitimate, non-contradictory interpretations, so there is no contradiction here. Okay, now let's move to the New Testament. Let's talk about the question, the 12? Turn with me to 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15:5. Paul states that Jesus appeared to the 12. 15:5 says, and he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. However, Matthew 27 verse 5 and Acts 1:15-26 show us that during the time Paul references, Judas had died and Matthias had not yet been chosen. So there were only 11 apostles. So the accusation is that Paul's not telling the truth, that Paul either didn't know what was going on or he misspoke or something, because at that time there were only 11 apostles. Now, how do we answer this? Well, again, the study and interpretation principles needed is context, context, context. If you were in the room with me together, we could all say context, context, context together. But we also need an understanding of the figurative use of numbers and titles. And this sounds complicated, but it's actually really simple. So let's talk about that figurative use of numbers as we examine this context, the literary context here. See, both Jewish and American cultures make heavy use of figurative numbers. Some examples would be the Big Ten, which I'm not a sports guy. I had to ask Steve about this. But the Big Ten is college football. And at one time, there was only 10 teams in the Big Ten. But since then, other teams have joined that league. And so now there's something like 15 teams in the Big Ten. But they still call it the Big Ten. They didn't increase that number every time a new group joined. They didn't say now it's the Big 11 and Big 12 and Big 13. They just say the Big 10. Or also 2x4s. Anyone who's gone and bought lumber knows that a 2x4 is not actually 2 inches by 4 inches, which is really annoying. It's, depending on where you buy it, somewhere around 3 3/4 inches by 1 3/4 inches, or 3.5 inches by 1.5 inches, depends on where you buy it. It's not actually 2 inches by 4 inches, yet we still call them a 2x4. See, applying this then to the 12, it's possible, even likely, that the term the 12 became synonymous with the apostles. It wasn't giving an exact count of the apostles, but it became a title, the 12, even if at the time there were only 11. There's a good argument to be made that even when in a particular location there might have only been 2 or 3 of the apostles, that someone might still say, well, let's go talk to the 12. Because, well, it's referring to the apostles. But also, there's another literary concept that could be at play here, and that is the use of prolipsis. Now, most of us don't use prolipsis in our everyday language, so a prolipsis is an anachronistic representation of something as existing before its proper or historical time. Another big word, anachronistic, is basically a false or intentionally not exact usage of a word. So the idea here would be like if we said the prophet Moses was pulled from the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter. Well, when he was pulled from the Nile, he wasn't the prophet. He was just a baby. But no one's going to say, "Ha ha, you contradicted yourself," when we say that the prophet Moses was pulled from the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter. Because even though he wasn't yet a prophet, we're using a prolipsis to refer to who this guy is, using the title before it was actually properly historically accurate. So, applying that to the 12, by the time that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, Matthias had been an apostle for quite a while. And so Paul may have been including him in the 12. I mean, after all, part of the requirements put forth in Acts chapter 1 for Matthias to be an apostle was that he had to be with Jesus from the beginning of his ministry and seen him resurrected. So, even if Matthias wasn't an apostle at the time that Jesus appeared to him, he did see Jesus after he had raised from the dead. So, the answer, well, Paul's use of the 12 does not represent a contradiction to the number of apostles to whom Jesus appeared, whether it is because he's using the 12 as synonymous with the apostles, or whether because he's referring to Matthias, even though he wasn't at the time an apostle. Either way, there's no contradiction here. Okay, now there are many, many more alleged numerical contradictions we could go through. And in fact, I had to shorten this down. I had 4 or 5 examples in my first take of this, but it was going to be way too long. So, let's now move on to alleged geographical contradictions. That is, contradictions having to do with places. The first one, question. Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, fact or fiction? Let's get into this. So, Matthew 2:1 and Luke 2:39 through 40 both record that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now, we're familiar with this, right? Let's go to Matthew 2, verse 1 says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem." Okay, so Jesus was born in Bethlehem. However, in these other passages, Jesus is known for being from Galilee. Let's go to the Mark passage. Mark 1:24 says, and we'll go back to 23 to get the idea. "Just then there was a man in the synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, 'What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.'" Okay, now this passage and the other ones I have listed all reference people saying, "Hey, this is Jesus of Nazareth," or Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. And then the real crux of this argument comes from John 7. John 7, verses 41 and 42. We're going to actually start in verse 40. John 7, verse 40. "Some of the people, therefore, when they heard these words, were saying, 'This certainly is the prophet.' Others were saying, 'This is the Christ.' Still others were saying, 'Surely the Christ is not going to come from Galilee, is he? Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the descendants of David, and from Bethlehem, the village where David was?'" Okay, so these folks, they know, without a shadow of a doubt, that Jesus is from Nazareth in Galilee. And they know, because of the scripture, that the Messiah is supposed to come from Bethlehem. And so the accusation made is that, well, Matthew and Luke made up the story of Jesus being born in Bethlehem to fit the narrative, to make it look like he fit the bill for the Messiah. So how do we answer this? Well, the study and interpretation principles needed. Again, here we are. Ready? Context, context, context. And that's it. Context, context, context. Let's examine the context. So, quite frankly, place of birth is not the same as the place in which a person grew up. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but he grew up in Galilee. In fact, as you read through the Matthew account and the other accounts too, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but then they went to Egypt to avoid Herod. And then they came back, and because Herod's son was still ruling, they went all the way up to Galilee to stay away from Herod's offspring, Herod's child, Herod's son. So he was born in Bethlehem, but he grew up in Galilee. Now we should all be familiar with that, right? Like, I was born in Brighton, Colorado, but I grew up in Keensburg, Colorado. My son was born in Concord, but spent the first part of his life in Plymouth, and now is from Franklin. We all tend to be moving around, and we may not be born in the same place that we grew up. Now, more specifically, John 7:42 through 41, addressing these, the bystanders, they're not authoritative. They apparently do not know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. They just know where he was currently from. And that right there is important. The Bible records people saying things, and it records what they say accurately. That doesn't mean that what the people said was accurate. There are, in the Bible, events where someone lies, and the Bible records the lie. That doesn't mean that the Bible condones the lie. It doesn't mean that the Bible is lying. It means that it is recording an event where somebody lied. So these bystanders, this is just recording what they said, what they thought, not what was actually the truth. So the answer, well, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but he grew up in Galilee. No real contradiction there. You can be born in one place and grow up in another. Okay, pretty straightforward. Let's do another one. Jesus' sermon, on a mount or on a plain? And Jim dealt with this some when he covered the Sermon on the Mount in Mark, but let's get into it. Matthew 5:1 states that Jesus went up on the mountain to preach a sermon. Matthew 5:1, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Okay, then he goes and he preaches the Beatitudes. He addresses some misunderstandings they had about the old law. He addresses true righteousness. But then take a look at Luke 6, where it states that Jesus stood on a level place to preach a sermon. Luke 6, verse 17, Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place. And there was a large crowd of his disciples, and a great throng of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal regions of Tyre and Sidon. Okay, then he goes on and he gives the Beatitudes, and he addresses some misunderstandings about the old covenant, and he addresses some areas of righteousness. So, the accusation made is that this is the same sermon, but Matthew records it as being on a mountain, where Luke records it being on a level place. Okay. Study and interpretation principles needed. Again, context, context, context. And again, that's all. Context. Let's examine the context. We have, again, two options. Option one, well, a sermon can be preached in multiple locations. It is possible, even likely, that Jesus preached the same precepts at different locations. And you think about that. They didn't have live streaming. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have video recordings, audio recordings. They didn't have any of that. And so Jesus would preach a sermon in one place, but then he'd travel. And do you think he preached something completely different that nobody had ever heard before? No, he probably preached the same concepts. And when you read these two sermons, they're extremely similar, but they're not exactly the same. He covers the same concepts, but he uses slightly different wording. He uses slightly different structure, which you would expect. You know, I've preached the same sermon in multiple locations before. I'll preach it here in Tilton, and then I'll maybe go preach it at a supporting congregation. And while it's the same sermon, it's not word for word verbatim the same. It's slight differences. So it is very likely that Jesus preached the same precepts at various different locations. The option two is that there are flat places on mountains, and Jesus could have been preaching from a flat place on a mountain. I personally prefer option one, but it is conceivable that on the mountain they found a flat place. I mean, think about if you ever gone hiking at Rattlesnake Mountain here in the Lakes region. You hike up a pretty steep hill, and then There's a flat spot that's big enough we could fit the entire congregation up there, but it's on a mountain. So, the answer, well, there's no contradiction here, as Jesus could either have preached his sermon multiple times or preached from a level spot on a mountain. Either option would work. Okay, next question. And this one gets a little bit more in-depth. Where did Peter deny Christ? Okay, let's read this. Matthew 26, 57 through 75. We're not going to read the whole section, but go to Matthew 26. Matthew 26, starting in verse 57, we read, "Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome." And then it goes on and talks about the trial and talks about how Peter denied Jesus. However, John 18, 13 through 27 indicates that Peter denied Jesus in the courtyard of the high priest Annas. John 18, well, really starting in verse 12. John 18, 12. "So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him, and led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in." Okay, now it goes on with the rest of the account, which we'll handle in a minute. But the accusation made here is that Matthew states that Peter denied Jesus in the courtyard of the high priest Caiaphas, but John indicates that he denied Jesus in the courtyard of the high priest Annas. Now, let's address the high priest part first. This particular point in history was interesting because there was the guy who should have been the high priest, and then there was the guy that the Romans appointed as high priest. So there's some politics there. But the big thing is, where exactly did Peter deny Christ? In the courtyard of Caiaphas or in the courtyard of Annas? Now, the interpretation and study principles needed is, of course, context, but also an understanding of first century politics and also family matters. So let's examine the context a little bit. And we're going to look at the timeline of John 18, verses 13 through 14, which we already read. Jesus is taken to Annas, who, as it says, is the father-in-law of Caiaphas. And that becomes important in a minute. Verses 15 through 18, Peter denies Jesus in the first time in the courtyard of the high priest. We read, starting in we already read 15 and 16. Let's start in 17. "Then a slave girl who kept the door said to Peter, 'You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?' He said, 'I am not.' Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves, and Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself." However, then in verse 24, Annas sent Jesus to Caiaphas. Verse 24, "So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest." That is, they sent Jesus to Caiaphas the high priest. So Jesus is brought to Annas, Peter denies him, Jesus is sent to Caiaphas, and then in verse 25 through 27, Peter denies Jesus 2 more times. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter then denied it, and immediately a rooster crowed. Now, one thing I want us to note about this is that it doesn't specifically say that Peter was in the courtyard of Annas, just that he was in the courtyard of the high priest. And that brings us to the idea of non-chronological writing. We already addressed this some at the beginning of the sermon, but let's talk about it more. John does not specifically say Peter was in the courtyard of Annas. And often Hebrew writers will not record events chronologically. So Peter might have been at the courtyard of Caiaphas the whole time. In fact, it could be that as this event is playing out, as Peter is at this courtyard, either he had followed Jesus to Annas' courtyard and then followed him to Caiaphas, and John is recording it in the way you record it, or they might have been in the courtyard of Annas the whole time, or of Caiaphas the whole time. But there's another layer to this that's worth discussing, and that is family relationship. See, Caiaphas was the son-in-law of Annas. Annas might have been visiting his son-in-law. Remember, over in Matthew, it said that the scribes and the elders of the Jews were already gathered at the high priest's residence. And you would expect that the elder high priest would be included in that collection of people who were gathering at the high priest's place to see this whole trial. So they could be in the same location. But also it was not uncommon for extended families to share a residence. Thus, it is also possible that Annas and Caiaphas shared the same palace. The courtyard that we're speaking of could be the courtyard of the family home of both Annas and Caiaphas. Caiaphas having one section and Annas having another, but the courtyard being in the middle. That was really common in that time period. So, whether Caiaphas was visiting Annas' house or whether Annas and Caiaphas shared a residence, it is entirely possible that this sending Jesus bound to Annas could be just a move from one location to another in the same residence, in the same compound, as it were. I personally think that that is probably pretty highly likely. So the answer? Well, Peter denied Jesus in the courtyard of the high priest, and there are many perfectly acceptable explanations for the timeline that is given. There's no contradiction. It fits. Okay. Now, there are a lot more supposed geographical contradictions that we could cover, some of which are really kind of interesting, but very intricate, and you have to really lay things out to understand them. But today, as we've been addressing these alleged numerical and geographical contradictions, we've seen that each of them is answerable. You can answer these supposed contradictions, and there is actually no legitimate contradiction. And so I would encourage you whenever you come across one of these supposed contradictions, let's devote the time to study out these supposed contradictions so that they don't shake our faith. Your faith is so important. And I know your time is valuable. You have lots of things that could take up your time, movies and TV shows and activities and sports and hiking and all the things, right? But I encourage you, take the time to study these supposed contradictions. And if you're sitting there saying, but I don't know how, and we're going to talk about that more in some coming sermons, but also I would encourage you, pick up that book series, The Anvil Rings by Eric Lyons. He dives into these things and lays them out very clearly and in a way that is easy to understand. Don't let your faith be destroyed by these supposed contradictions. Now, it's kind of hard to do an invitation when we're all in our own homes. Obviously, I can't have you say, come on down the aisle and one of the elders will talk to you. But if you have a need, you can get in touch with the elders of the congregation. Their contact info is on Lightpost. Most of you all have it. If you have a need, please contact the elders. Let them know that you have some need. They will help you. They will pray with you. And we have a number of prayer requests that were put up on Lightpost, and I apologize that we had gotten lax with making sure those were getting posted, and so a bunch of them got posted last night. There's a lot of people that have health needs and other needs going on. Please look at those prayer requests, pray for your brethren, and reach out to each other. Give each other a phone call, give each other a text. Make sure people are doing well and encourage one another. And hopefully next week it will not be snowing. I have no idea. I'm not a meteorologist, but hopefully we can gather together in person, see each other, and encourage one another face to face. Thank you so much for tuning in, for watching the live stream, and I hope that you have a great rest of your Sunday. Oh, and if you haven't already, spend some time singing songs with your family, doing some prayers, and doing the Lord's Supper. We're not broadcasting that aspect of worship. We're leaving that to you to take care of in your homes. Thank you, and God bless.